The orcs were 3 days gone when Sergeant Major Corin told us to play. 3 months we had fought without pause through Khalistan Secundus's toxic jungles, and now this grizzled veteran, his face more scar than skin, was ordering us to throw knives for fun. I did not understand. None of us did. But that afternoon, watching a blade spin through humid air and bite into scrap metal, while men who had been killing for 90 days laughed like they had never seen death, I learned something the Imperial Guard's propaganda never tells you, that sometimes survival itself is not enough. My name is Corporal Daveth Vrenn, and I have served the Imperium for 9 years, 4 months, and 17 days. I know the count because we all know the count. Every soldier of the Astra Militarum carries their service like a second skin, wearing the days as both badge and burden. I have seen 14 campaigns across 7 worlds. I have watched entire regiments reduced to ash and memory. I have stood in trenches so deep that the sky became a distant rumor, and I have marched across battlefields where the dead outnumbered the living by ratios that would break a lesser mind. I have killed for the Emperor. I have bled for the Emperor. I have watched my brothers and sisters die for the Emperor. Their last words, prayers or curses, or sometimes just the wet gurgle of punctured lungs. But that is not the whole story. The Departamento Munitorum understands what the propaganda never admits. A soldier is not just a weapon to be fired until the barrel melts. A soldier is flesh and mind, and flesh grows tired, and minds fracture under pressure that never relents. So they give us moments. Brief, stolen fragments of time when the guns fall silent and the world stops trying to kill us long enough for us to remember what it means to be human. These moments are rare, they are precious. They are absolutely necessary, and they are stranger than anything I have encountered in all my years of service. That first day on Khalistan, I wandered through the camp in a daze, watching other guardsmen adapt to peace with varying degrees of success. Some fell asleep immediately, their bodies claiming the rest their minds were too traumatized to request. Others cleaned their weapons with obsessive thoroughness, unable to trust that the silence would last. I found myself drawn to a cluster of soldiers near the edge of the perimeter, where someone had set up a makeshift arena using ammunition crates and salvaged tarpaulin. They were playing a game. The realization struck me with absurd force. Grown men and women, each of them killers hardened by months of constant warfare, were throwing knives at a crude target someone had painted on scavenged metal. They were laughing, not the manic laughter that sometimes erupted during firefights, but genuine amusement. One of them, a trooper named Vess from 2nd Platoon, noticed me staring and called me over. His invitation was friendly, casual, as if we were not surrounded by a jungle full of corpses and unexploded ordnance. I joined them. I threw knives at the target and discovered I was terrible at it, my hands too used to the weight of a lasgun to adjust to the different balance. They gave me advice. They corrected my grip, my stance, my release. They treated me like a fellow human being rather than just another body filling out the firing line. For the first time in months, I felt something other than fear or exhaustion or the grim determination that passed for courage in the Imperial Guard. I felt almost peaceful. That night I slept without nightmares for the first time since Khalistan, and when I woke, I understood something fundamental about service in the Astra Militarum. We are not machines. The Imperium wants us to be machines, efficient and unquestioning, but flesh cannot sustain that transformation indefinitely. We need moments of humanity, or we lose the capacity to function entirely. Recreation is not weakness. It is maintenance. It is the mental equivalent of the sacred oils and litanies that keep our equipment operational. Without it, we break. The Departamento Munitorum has calculated the acceptable attrition rates, the optimal ratio of combat to rest, the precise threshold where a guardsman transitions from asset to liability. They have reduced human endurance to numbers on a data slate, and those numbers have determined that recreation is not a luxury, but a tactical necessity. The forms that recreation takes are as varied as the regiments themselves. I have seen guardsmen organize prayer circles, their voices rising in hymns to the God Emperor that sound sweeter than any cathedral choir because they come from throats that have screamed themselves raw. I have watched soldiers trade hand-carved tokens, little pieces of wood or bone transformed into art during the endless hours of waiting that punctuate warfare. These tokens become currency, but more than that, they become connection. Each one represents time and thought, a deliberate choice to create rather than destroy. Some guardsmen read, treasuring battered books passed down through generations of soldiers, their pages stained with blood and promethium but still legible. Others write, filling journals with thoughts they would never speak aloud, documenting their experiences for an audience that will likely never read them, but which provides purpose in the act of recording itself. But not all recreation is so gentle. The Imperial Guard draws from every corner of the Imperium, from hive worlds where violence is entertainment and feral worlds where civilization is a rumor at best. On Mordian Prime, where I spent 6 months fighting heretic militias through the ruins of hab blocks that had stood for 10,000 years, I witnessed pit fighting that would have made even an Arbeits enforcer uncomfortable. Guardsmen from the Catachan regiments would challenge each other to bare-knuckle brawls while their comrades formed rings, and wagered everything from ration packs to personal weapons. The fights were savage, leaving both participants bloody and occasionally unconscious, but they were also consensual and somehow cathartic. The violence had rules, it had limits, it was violence they chose rather than violence inflicted upon them, and that distinction mattered more than any soft-hearted observer could understand. I watched a Catachan sergeant named Harker fight 7 bouts in a single evening, winning 5 and losing 2 but grinning through broken teeth after every match. When I asked him why he subjected himself to such punishment during the precious hours when he could simply rest, he looked at me with genuine confusion. He explained that on Catachan, childhood is measured not in years but in survival milestones, that every citizen of that hell world must prove themselves against the countless predators that make the planet's jungles home to nightmares. Fighting is not recreation for them, it is the identity. The Departamento Munitorum allows the pit fights, carefully monitoring them to ensure they do not escalate beyond acceptable casualty rates. Because Catachan regiments are among the most effective infantry units in the entire Imperial Guard. You do not break what works. Then there are the Valhallans, who bring ice with them wherever they go. I served alongside the 597th Valhallan Regiment on Boros XI, a planet covered in rust-red sand and heat that turned your armor into a torture device. The Valhallans suffered more than most in that environment, their biology optimized for sub-zero temperatures. During our brief respites from combat, the Valhallans would gather in the deepest bunkers and tell stories of their homeworld. They spoke of cities carved into glaciers, of the great ice crawlers that hunted across frozen seas, of blizzards so fierce they could strip flesh from bone in minutes. One evening, their regimental commander, Colonel Castine, organized what she called a remembrance festival. The Valhallans had somehow acquired ice. I never discovered where they obtained it on a planet where water only existed in carefully rationed containers. They built sculptures, working with desperate speed before the heat could melt their creations back into anonymous water. The sculptures were beautiful and strange, abstract forms that somehow captured the alien geometry of their frozen homeworld. They sang songs in their native dialect, harsh-sounding to my Cadian-trained ears but clearly meaningful to them. For a few hours, they were not soldiers of the Imperium fighting on a hostile world. They were simply Valhallans, maintaining connection to a home that most of them would never see again. The ice melted eventually, as it always must, and the sculptures became puddles that evaporated within minutes. But the meaning remained, carried in memory and tradition, and when we returned to combat the next morning, the Valhallans fought with renewed determination. I remember a guardsman named Terence from the Krieg Death Korps, which made his presence in our regiment unusual before even considering his personality. The Death Korps are legendary for their grim determination and absolute disregard for their own lives, products of a culture so steeped in guilt and atonement that death in service to the Emperor is not sacrifice but obligation. Terence had been separated from his regiment during a particularly chaotic extraction on Catachan V, picked up by our transport through either bureaucratic error or simple chaos. He should have been reassigned immediately, but the Munitorum's organizational wheels turned slowly, and so he remained with us for nearly 4 months. During that time, he gradually thawed, though thawed is perhaps too strong a word for the subtle changes we observed. He started joining our knife-throwing games, though his skill was intimidating enough that we eventually banned him from competitions for fairness. He would sit by fires during the evening hours, listening to the stories and jokes and casual blasphemies that soldiers trade when the officers are not watching. He never contributed much, his conditioning too deep to overcome entirely, but his presence became familiar. Then, one evening, he approached me with a question that had clearly taken him significant courage to formulate. He asked what it meant to enjoy something. The question was so fundamentally alien, delivered in his flat Krieg accent through the muffled distortion of his rebreather mask, that I initially thought I had misheard. But he was serious. The concept of recreation for its own sake, rather than as a tactical necessity for maintaining combat effectiveness, was genuinely foreign to him. I tried to explain, fumbling for words that could bridge the gap between our experiences. I told him about the knife throwing, how the satisfaction came not from improving a skill that might save his life, but from the simple pleasure of watching the blade spin and stick in the target. I told him about the warmth in my chest when I succeeded, the absence of fear or pressure or obligation. I told him it was about being human rather than being a soldier. He thought about this for a long time, sitting beside me in silence while the firebase hummed with evening routine. Then he removed his glove, which was shocking in itself since the Death Korps almost never remove any piece of their equipment, and touched the ground with his bare hand. Just touched it, feeling the texture of dirt and stone and the faint warmth retained from the day's sun. He said nothing, but something in the angle of his shoulders suggested revelation. 2 weeks later, he was finally reassigned back to a Death Korps regiment, and I never saw him again. I like to think he carried some fragment of that evening with him, some small seed of understanding that even a soldier bred for death might cultivate something resembling joy. I like to think this because the alternative, that he returned to his regiment and buried that nascent humanity beneath duty and atonement, is too sad to contemplate for long. Alcohol flows through the Guard like a second bloodstream. The Catachans favor something they call devil's breath, a spirit so potent that it supposedly burns going down and burns coming back up. The Valhallans produce vodka that could strip rust from metal. The Cadians, my people, prefer a beer called Blackguard, dark and bitter, and strong enough to blur the edges of memory without completely obliterating consciousness. These are tools, chemical hammers used to pound the day's experiences into manageable shapes, to smooth the sharp corners of trauma until sleep becomes possible. The drinking itself becomes ritual. We gather in small groups, usually arranged by squad or platoon. Someone always starts with a toast, though the subject varies. Sometimes we toast the Emperor. Sometimes we toast fallen comrades, speaking names that deserved a remembrance even if the wider Imperium will never record them. The alcohol facilitates conversation in ways that sobriety does not. Guardsmen who never speak about their experiences will suddenly open up after their third drink, sharing fears and doubts that would be dangerous in clearer states of mind. The next morning, there is an unspoken agreement that such conversations never happened, that the confessions made under alcohol's influence exist in a separate reality where judgment is suspended and vulnerability is permitted. The commissars watch the drinking carefully, always present at the periphery. They are looking for signs of excess, for the guardsman who drinks too much and becomes a liability. But mostly they watch because watching is what commissars do. Black-coated figures standing in shadows, and we speak carefully even when drunk, editing our words with the unconscious precision of people who know that the wrong phrase can earn a bolt round through the skull. Gambling is equally universal. I have seen guardsmen wager on everything from card games to elaborate contests of marksmanship, where the stakes included personal weapons and body armor. The gambling is rarely about the money. It is about having something to lose and something to win, about introducing an element of chance into lives where chance usually manifests as enemy artillery landing in your trench. There is dark humor in watching soldiers gamble away their possessions when they might not survive the week to enjoy their winnings, but that darkness is part of the point. It is an acknowledgement of mortality without surrender to despair. The most disturbing form of recreation I witnessed was what we called the death lottery on Mordian. Each guardsman would write their predicted date and manner of death on a slip of paper, fold it, and place it in a container. A designated keeper would catalog all the predictions and track outcomes. When a guardsman died, their prediction would be checked. If they had guessed correctly, their winnings would be distributed to their survivors. If they had guessed incorrectly, the pot continued to grow. The entire practice was morbid beyond description, reducing human mortality to a gambling game, but it served a purpose. It forced us to confront our deaths directly, to think about the how and when, rather than living in constant low-grade fear of abstract doom. Making the prediction was an act of agency, claiming some small measure of control over the uncontrollable. Most predictions were wrong, because predicting your own death with any accuracy requires either prophetic gifts or suicidal planning. But the few correct predictions took on legendary status, stories told and retold as evidence that we understood the nature of our service, that we faced our mortality with clear eyes rather than comforting delusions. I have seen guardsmen paint, their works ranging from crude depictions of their homeworlds to abstract expressions of inner turmoil that would not be out of place in a civilized world's galleries. The paintings are usually made on whatever surfaces are available. I have seen art on the sides of chimera transports, on the walls of bunkers, on the backs of uniforms that will never be worn again after the paint sets. The act of creation is therapeutic regardless of the subject matter, transforming passive experience into active expression. I knew a trooper from Necromunda who could create remarkably detailed figures from spent shell casings and wire. He worked during any downtime, his hands constantly busy, producing tiny statues of guardsmen in various poses. He never kept them. He would finish a piece, display it briefly, and then give it away to whoever wanted it. When I asked him why he did not keep his own work, he shrugged and said that the creating was the point, not the possession. The act of making something brought him peace. The finished product was just evidence that the act had occurred. On Talan, the Contrat, desert world where warfare has been a way of life for millennia, I encountered a tradition they called sand painting. Soldiers would collect sand of different colors from various regions of the planet, each color carrying its own significance based on which battles had been fought in that location. They would create elaborate mandalas, working for hours to produce geometric patterns of startling complexity. Once completed, the sand paintings would be displayed for a brief time, allowing others to appreciate the work, and then deliberately destroyed. The impermanence was the point. They were creating beauty with the full knowledge that it would not last, that the desert winds would eventually scatter even the memory of their effort. In this way, they mimicked the nature of life itself, particularly life in the Imperial Guard. Everything is temporary, everything ends. But the act of creation still matters, perhaps matters more because of its ephemeral nature. Food becomes recreation, when food is one of the few pleasures available to you. The standard guard rations are nutritionally sufficient and relentlessly terrible, processed products designed for long-term storage rather than taste. Some guardsmen became experts at modifying their meals, adding local ingredients when available. I knew a sergeant who carried an extensive collection of spices through every campaign, tiny vials of expensive imported seasonings that he would use to transform bland protein bars into something resembling actual food. He guarded those spices more carefully than his weapon. They represented civilization, the assertion that we were still human beings with preferences and desires rather than merely biological machines requiring fuel. When fresh food became available, which was rare enough to qualify as a special occasion, the change in atmosphere was remarkable. I remember the arrival of fresh fruit on Cronus, delivered as part of a celebration following a major strategic victory. The distribution was carefully managed, each soldier receiving a single piece of fruit. I received an apple, red and impossibly perfect, still cool from the transport's refrigeration units. I held it for a long time before eating it, appreciating its weight and texture, the way light reflected off its skin. When I finally bit into it, the flavor was so intense after months of bland rations that I nearly wept. Others did weep, tears running down weathered cheeks as they ate slowly, savoring every bite. We were not crying for the fruit itself. We were crying because for one brief moment, we were connected to the wider Imperium, to the agricultural worlds and complex civilization that we defended but rarely experienced. We were crying because we were, temporarily, more than just soldiers. Games of strategy are popular among officers and NCOs, though they trickle down to the rank and file as well. Regicide, the ancient game of tactics and patience, is played on boards ranging from expensive sets with pieces carved from exotic materials to scratched grids in the dirt with stones serving as pieces. I learned regicide from a lieutenant who taught me that it is more than a game. It is training, preparing the mind for strategic thinking that separates competent leaders from those who waste their soldiers' lives through incompetence. More than that, it provides structure and challenge without the stakes of genuine warfare. You can lose a regicide match and learn from the experience. Combat offers no such luxury. Physical games take many forms, adapted to whatever space and equipment are available. I remember a particular ball game on Armageddon, organized during a rare lull in the fighting. Someone had found a ball, an actual manufactured ball, and the discovery triggered an impromptu tournament. Squads formed teams, challenges were issued and accepted, and for an entire afternoon we played with the intensity of soldiers who had briefly forgotten they were soldiers. The game was chaotic, rules negotiated on the fly. There was shouting and laughter and friendly violence, tackles that would have drawn medical attention in a civilian context but which we shrugged off with grins and insults. The final match came down to my squad against a group of Catachans who played with the same savage efficiency they brought to combat. We lost, narrowly, and the defeat stung with surprising intensity. But the sting was clean, uncomplicated by guilt or trauma. It was just a game, and we had lost, and that was acceptable in ways that real losses could never be. For those moments we were not soldiers of the Imperium facing existential threats. We were just people playing a game, and that simplicity was beautiful beyond expression. But recreation does not always save us. I watched a guardsman named Corel on Mordian, saw him staring at his lasgun with the distant expression of someone who had already made a decision. He had lost his entire original squad in a single engagement, replaced by strangers whose names he refused to learn because learning names meant accepting they would die too. Torvin saw it as well. That night, Torvin organized a game, insisted Corel play, kept him engaged for 3 hours with knife-throwing and regicide and forced conversation. Carol laughed twice that evening, hollow sounds but sounds nonetheless. We thought we had pulled him back from whatever edge he had been standing on. 3 days later, during a routine patrol, Carol walked into enemy fire. Not accidentally, not because of tactical necessity. He simply stood up from cover and walked forward, his lasgun hanging loose in his hands, while heretic rounds tore through him. The commissar ruled it combat death rather than cowardice or suicide, sparing Carol's memory and his family the shame. But we knew. Torvin knew. Recreation can buy time, can provide moments of respite, but it cannot fix what the war breaks beyond repair. Sometimes the fractures run too deep, and all the games and alcohol and human connection in the galaxy cannot bridge them. The sexual dimensions of recreation exist as surely as breath and hunger. The Imperial Guard is not celibate. You take millions of young men and women, place them in close proximity under extreme stress, give them brief windows when the immediate threat of death recedes, and basic biology asserts itself with predictable inevitability. I have seen relationships bloom in the strangest places, watched soldiers find comfort and connection in each other's arms during the brief hours between battles. Some relationships are tender, almost heartbreaking in their gentleness. Others are purely physical, desperate, and urgent. The commissars pretend not to notice as long as discipline holds. I fell in love on Cronus, with a guardswoman named Mira from the Scintillan Fusiliers. She was sharp-minded and darkly funny, possessed of resilient optimism that seemed impossible given our circumstances. We met during a prize, knife-throwing competition. She was terrible at it, worse even than I had been on Khalistan, but she laughed at her failures and kept trying. I offered advice, she accepted it with grace, and somehow that simple interaction became the beginning of something neither of us had planned. We spent our free hours together over the following weeks, talking about everything except the war. She told me about her homeworld, a civilized planet where she had been studying to become an engineer before her conscription. I told her about Cadia, about a childhood spent preparing for military service. We found commonality despite our different backgrounds. The physical aspect developed naturally, inevitable given proximity and mutual attraction, and the constant awareness that tomorrow was never guaranteed. We were careful, maintaining the discretion that regulations required. The sex itself was less important than the intimacy, the radical vulnerability of allowing another person to see you completely, without armor or weapons or masks. The relationship lasted 3 months before her regiment received transfer orders. 3 months measured against the eternity of the Imperium's wars is nothing, a rounding error. But those 3 months contained more genuine happiness than I had experienced in all my previous years of service. The day she left, I felt hollow in ways that combat had never achieved. We did not promise to find each other again because such promises are meaningless across the scales of time and space that govern the Imperial Guard. We simply held each other until the final moment, and then she left, and I returned to my duties with something precious missing. I never saw her again. I do not know if she survived. But I remember her, carry that memory carefully, and the pain of losing her was worth the joy of knowing her. My battle buddy for most of my service has been a guardsman named Torvin, a Cadian like myself. We were assigned to the same squad early in our service, and have managed through luck or bureaucratic inertia to remain together through multiple campaigns. Torvin is steady in ways I am not, possessed of calm competence that makes him reliable under fire. We have saved each other's lives enough times that we stopped counting. The debt, if it ever existed, has been paid so many times in both directions that the concept of debt no longer applies. We are simply partners, 2 halves of a functional unit. The relationship is not romantic and never has been, but it is love nonetheless, a different variety than what I felt for Mira, but no less real or important. Letter writing occupies a strange space in Guard recreation because letters sent rarely reach their intended recipients. The Imperium's communication networks are vast but unreliable, and mail delivery to active combat zones is prioritized far below ammunition and food. Still, Guardsmen write letters home, filling pages with carefully edited accounts of their experiences. The futility is obvious but beside the point. The act of writing is what matters, the momentary connection to a life outside the military. I write letters to my sister on Cadia, even though Cadia has fallen and my sister is almost certainly dead. The planet broke before the Guard did, so the saying goes, but the planet still broke, and everyone on it died or was scattered to the void. I know this logically, but I still write the letters, filling them with observations and questions and small details of daily life that would have interested her. I tell her about the worlds I have seen and the people I have met. When I write, she is alive. When I write, Cadia still stands. The letters accumulate in my personal kit, unread and unsent, but their existence matters because it represents my refusal to let go entirely. The ecclesiarchy provides recreation through devotion. Prayer services are regular features of Guard life, mandatory attendance enforced by commissars who stand at the back with their bolt, pistols visible. For some Guardsmen, this is genuine comfort. The certainty that their deaths will not be meaningless, that the Emperor watches and remembers, allows them to face horrors that would shatter a secular mind. For others, the services are simply another duty to endure. I fall somewhere between these extremes. I believe because doubt is dangerous, and because faith provides structure, but my belief is pragmatic rather than ecstatic. Yet even within rigid ecclesiarchal devotion, there are moments of genuine transcendence. I remember a service on Armageddon after we had been fighting for 36 hours straight, defending a manufactorum complex against greenskin assaults that seemed endless. When the orcs finally withdrew, the regimental confessor called for a service of thanksgiving. We gathered in the manufactorum's central yard, thousands of guardsmen standing among the rubble and bodies. The confessor was an old man, ancient by Guard standards. His robes were tattered, his augmetic eye flickering with damage he had not bothered to repair. When he spoke, his voice carried across the yard without amplification. He did not speak of glory or duty or tactical significance. Instead, he spoke of life. He thanked the God Emperor for the gift of another breath, another heartbeat, another moment of existence in a galaxy that sought constantly to extinguish humanity's light. He led us in hymns that started quietly but built to a crescendo, thousands of voices joining in imperfect harmony. The sound was beautiful. I say this without irony. In that moment, surrounded by death and destruction, the collective voice of the survivors raised in song was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. We were not celebrating our victory. We were celebrating the fact that we still existed to celebrate anything at all. Storytelling becomes ritualized, evolving into performances that blend truth and fiction until the distinction becomes irrelevant. Veterans tell stories of their campaigns, accounts that grow more elaborate with each telling. These stories preserve unit history, teach lessons about survival, and create shared identity. I have heard the same story told by multiple veterans, each version containing different details. There is the story about the last stand at Castorel, where a single squad held against an orc horde for 3 days until reinforcements arrived. Depending on who tells it, the squad ranges from 6 to 20 guardsmen, the orcs number from hundreds to tens of thousands. But the core remains consistent. A small group held impossible ground through courage and refusal to break. That core is what matters. The darkest forms of recreation involve gallows humor taken to extremes that would horrify anyone not intimately familiar with constant warfare. Guardsmen joke about death with casualness that sounds like madness. We make bets about who will die next and how. We tell jokes about commissars and Xenos and the Emperor himself, blasphemies that would earn immediate execution in any context except the strange moral space of soldiers who have already sacrificed everything. This humor is not cruelty. It is armor, psychological protection against grinding horror. If we can laugh at death, death has less power over us. I am not sure how much longer I can continue serving. 9 years, 4 months, and 17 days is longer than most guardsmen survive. Eventually, probability will catch up with me. I will die, almost certainly badly, and my death will barely be noted beyond my immediate squad. The Departamento Munitorum will scratch my name off a roster, promote someone to replace me, and continue prosecuting its endless wars without pause. This is not self-pity but simple observation. But until that inevitable day arrives, I will continue to seek out the moments of recreation whenever they become available. Tonight, after I finish this letter my sister will never read, I will join Torvin and the others by the fire. Someone will have found alcohol. Someone else will tell the story about Castorel, and the numbers will be different than last time, and that will not matter. We will throw knives at a target painted on salvaged metal, and we will laugh, and for a few hours the weight of the lasgun will lift from my phantom grip. Tomorrow we return to the killing, but tonight we are human, and that is enough. The Emperor protects, so they tell us, and perhaps he does in ways we cannot perceive. But down here in the mud and blood of actual combat, we protect each other through small acts of kindness and shared moments of peace. We create recreation because we need it, because without it we would lose ourselves entirely to the violence that defines our service. The knife still hangs heavy in my hand even when I am not holding it. But for brief, precious moments, we can set it down, and in those moments we remember what it means to be human rather than just soldiers. This is our rebellion against entropy and death. This insistence on finding joy despite everything. We are humanity's defenders, and we will continue defending not just the physical territory of the Imperium, but also the idea that life can contain something more than just survival. That existence can include pleasure and connection and meaning, even when everything is trying to convince us otherwise.